Hello everyone, welcome to this webinar about the critical appraisal of clinical practice guidelines. If you had the chance to have a look to previous webinars in the clinical practice guidelines groups, probably you remember this slide where I said the number of organizations that were working with grade and doing systematic reviews and later on clinical practice guidelines. Well, the issue is this number of organizations and much more organizations are working developing clinical practice guidelines. But the issue is that not all these guidelines have the quality and the methodological transparency we would like. Why we want to apprise a guideline? Well, this is a text from the agreed to manual saying the potential benefits of guidelines are only as good as the quality of the guidelines themselves. That means that if you want to do a clinical practice guideline to support clinical decisions to better do our job, then the guideline needs to be as good as the quality of our desire. Then to apply guidelines, we use tools or instruments as the agreed to instrument, which is a tool intended to assess or apprise the methodological rigor and transparency of a clinical practice guidelines. So it's a tool that easily can help us to go through a guideline trying to identify if this guideline has the quality we expect. The aim of this tool or this instrument is to provide a framework to assess the quality of the guidelines, the definition of quality we have in mind, to provide a methodological strategy for the development of guidelines. That means that not only to read critically the practice guidelines, but also to have like a guideline to develop our proper CPG. And in the first place, inform what information and how information ought to be reported in the guidelines. So, as you can see, it's an instrument very similar to other instruments as Prisma or Consort, where we can use it as a checklist to apprise critically some studies, or even to use as a tool for develop new guidelines. Then, to go thoroughly on this tool, the agreed to tool, first of all, AGREE stands for Appraisal of Guidelines for Research and Evaluation. This is an instrument, as I mentioned before, that evaluates the quality of the guideline development process and also the quality of reporting, which is something very important. Not only the way the guideline is done, but also the way the guideline is reporting the results. Sometimes the methodology could be very, very good, but the way it's reported is not so good. That's one of the main issues when we check some clinical practice guidelines in the format of an article in a peer review, because they have like constrained number of pages to report the results. Sometimes the clinical practice guidelines is poorly reported. The original instrument was the AGREE, and now they have updated, not now, I mean like 5 or 6 years ago, they updated and refined the first instrument, and now we have the agreed to. So now the agreed to is the new tool for the assessment of practice guidelines, and is a reliable and a trusty tool or instrument to critically apprise guidelines. So if we go ahead with this guideline, with this tool, the agreed tool has 23 items in 6 domains. So the 6 domains cover 23 like questions that we have to search or to go thoroughly when we critically apprise a guideline. So the first of the 6 domain is the domain called scope and purpose. This domain covers the items number 1, 2, and 3, and is concerned with the overall aim of the guideline, the specific health questions, and the target population. The domain number 2, which is stakeholder involvement, covers items between 4 and 6. This domain focuses on the extent to which the guidelines was developed by the appropriate stakeholders and represents the views of its intended users. So it's important, this domain, in the terms of if everybody is well represented in the teamwork, and also if it's the guideline represents the views of all the intended users, patients, decision makers, or whatever. The domain number 3, rigor of development, relates to the process used to gather and synthesize the evidence. So cover the methods to formulate the recommendations and to update them. So here is the big part about how the systematic review for each of the questions has been done. The domain number 4, clarity of presentation, covers the items 15, 16, and 17, and deals with the language, structure, and format of the guideline. So how it's written, how it's explained, and if the language is appropriate or not. The domain number 5, the applicability, covers the items between 18 and 21. Applicability pertains to the likely barriers and facilitators for the implementation, and the strategies to improve uptake of the guideline, and the resource implication of applying the guidelines is related to how you are going to disseminate these clinical practice guidelines, how to implement, how you are going to deal with the uptake, and so on. And the last domain, the number 6, is the editorial independence. So it's concerned with the formulation of recommendations not being unduly biased with competing interests. So this is related, if you remember when we were talking in the training about the conflict of interest, there is a big issue with the conflict of interest, not related to avoid people with conflict of interest to work in the guideline, but with the identification of the areas that people with conflict of interest need to be excluded of. Okay, so now we know that this tool has 23 items and 6 domains. So here you have one example, which is the first item of the first domain. So if you remember, the domain scope and purpose over the first 3 items or questions. So this is the way the guidance helps you for rating each of the items. So we have a scale from 1 strongly disagree until 7 strongly agree. We will go through this later on. Then you have an open space if you want to write down something, some comments. Then a description from the user's manuals, one tip about where to look and how to rate. So this is one example. Imagine that we need to have like 23 of these examples. So how we rate? So as I mentioned before, we have a rating scale from 1, which means strongly disagree, to 7 strongly agree. So when we score 1, well, we score 1 when there is no information about this item at all, or the concept is very poorly reported, or even if the author states clearly that the criteria were not met. So this is the case where we score 1. On the other side, we score 7 if the quality of reporting is very good, is exceptional, and also when the full criteria of this item and all the considerations are met in this guide. And between 2 and 6, well, this depends on how it's reported. So from something that does not meet the full criteria or considerations, or even is not very well reported, but the information is there. So there is a tip, if you remember in the previous slide, there were sections saying how to rate, and you can have some help there. Well, And how we calculate the domain scores once we have a score or once we have used this rating scale? Well, as you can see here in the example, imagine that we have 4 appraisers and we have 3 items. We have the scores of each of these appraisers for each of the items. So we sum up all these numbers for appraiser, do a big sum, and then we use this formula. So we calculate the total of the scores from the 4 appraisers and use the maximum and minimum possible scores to make this simple calculation. The result is given in percentage. So here we have, there is a 57% of agreement in these domains. Well, the way we appraise critically the guideline is, as I mentioned, using these examples I've given before, using 1 page per item with some tips about what to read through, some tips about how to rate, and using this rating scale. Agree also use 1 checklist you have here in the screen. So the checklist is divided in 3 sections or 3 areas. The first one, as you can see, shaded in green on the left, is checklist item and description. We have here the name of the domain. Again, the example is the domain 1, scope and purpose. Then we have the 3 items below, objectives, questions, and population, and some information about each of these items to be reported. Then we have another section in the middle of the page, shaded in the screen on red, and you have some reporting criteria, and you can tick in each of the boxes depending on the presence or not of these criteria. For example, health intent, if the guideline has an aim of prevention, screening, diagnosis, treatment, if there are well-defined outcomes and expected benefits, and if the population is defined, and so on. So once you check in the proper box, you could report on the next section on the right, shaded in blue, you can report the page where this item is present. So this is a way to make a good reading with this checklist. So if you want just to have a look and check if everything is in the guideline, you can use the checklist. If you want to critical appraise using quantitative system, you should go through all the process as I showed you before with all the domains and items. This checklist also helps you to check when you are working on a guideline, allows you to check if you have covered everything you need to cover. Okay, so summarizing, we need to think about clinical decisions using a clinical practice guidelines. That means that we are going to use clinical practice guidelines to support clinical decisions. So it's a tool for us to work. So we need to really be sure that the clinical practice guidelines has the quality we expect in one clinical practice guideline. So that is something sometimes we forget, because we think about the developer of the guideline is a society or institution, and sometimes we doesn't put an eye on how these guidelines are developed. And also we need to distinguish between clinical practice guidelines and consensus reports, where these consensus reports obviously not always use systematic review to address all the questions. So secondly, read critically and apprise the CPG. So I imagine that in our day work, we don't have time to go through all the items and score all the items, but probably if we use the checklist we have seen in the previous slide, we can check briefly if all the issues are covered, or at least to have an idea that the big domains are well established. And finally, Agree to is an easy tool to do it. It's very well written. You have a lot of helps and tips to go through the process, so you don't need to have strong knowledge on advance. So I think it's really easy to use, and if you once you have used a couple of times, some of the issues are clear, crystal clear, so you can go ahead and make a good price. So now you have any question, is your time. In the meantime, I'm going to show you how to go ahead with this. So you can find all supporting material here. We will put today all the manuals, checklists, and everything from Agree to on the website, so you can find in our file, the clinical practice guideline file, you can find all the information, all the manuals, and everything. Okay, so thank you for your time, and hope you enjoy this webinar.